If you look at what's happening in America today, you can say, all right, we have a series of symptoms, and when you analyze what those symptoms are, the conclusion is you're suffering from a bout of fascism. We've militarized law enforcement. We're going after the independence of university. We're going after museums and cultural institutions. We're dismantling independent ombudsman structures, independent watchdog structures. We're normalizing the presence of secret police. Every single one of those is a textbook symptom of a society falling into fascism. And unless we identify that, and unless we say, look, here's why it's fascism, then we are not going to have any roadmap to get out of this nightmare.
Welcome to episode 259 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. This is Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show, and I'm so glad to be back with you after 2 weeks off. Refuse Fascism works to unite all who can be united to join in mass nonviolent protests and resistance in the streets and throughout society, growing to include millions and refusing to stop until we create such a profound political crisis that Trump cannot impose his fascist program or even maintain his hold on power. Much thanks to our patrons, everyone who rates, reviews, shares the show, and reps our merch. Every bit helps connect more people with Refuse Fascism. So after listening to today's episode, please give us a rating, write a review, check out our shop, and become a patron if you aren't already. Today, we're sharing an interview with Sasha Abramsky, Western correspondent for The Nation. But first, the Trump fascist regime has federalized the DC police, deployed the National Guard and the FBI to patrol DC streets, and threatened more military force to control and intimidate DC, while ICE continues to carry out Gestapo terror on immigrants. We've seen all week how they've been harassing Black youth and bulldozing homeless encampments. Yesterday, Saturday, August 16th, Refuse Fascism mobilized an estimated 2,000 protesters in marking the end of the first week of Trump's fascist takeover of DC, with a defiant march from Dupont Circle to and around the White House, blowing whistles and chanting, "Trump must go now. Kita via Trump, free DC, troops on the corner, feds on the block, the fascist takeover must be stopped." And I was honored to be amongst them, and I was honored to speak at this protest, which included many other folks, including Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler, Senior Advisor for Fellowship for Reconciliation, Jolly Good Ginger, yes, that Jolly, and Corey Teague of the National Action Network, along with others, to be part of saying no fascist takeover of DC, Trump must go now. And at the rally before the march, I was thrilled to share an urgent and audacious call from refusefascism.org, a bold plan that I believe measures up to what we face. It's a call that's open to everyone, initiated by Refuse Fascism, but one that can only succeed if we unite to carry it forward. I hope this will explain why my voice sounds like this right now. So have a listen.
The Trump fascist regime is illegitimate. Its power grab in Washington, D.C. is illegitimate. The militarization of the streets of the Capitol is illegitimate. The attacks on our immigrant siblings, the homeless, the youth, our whole community is illegitimate. And as this beautiful person right there has a sign that says, "History has its eyes on us." takeover of DC. I am here because the only real solution is for us to rise to the historic challenge to drive this regime from power, not in 2026, not in 2028, but right fucking now. Trump must go now. Trump must go now. Trump must go now. Trump must go now. So today, I'm going to lay out why we say this. And I'm also going to lay out what we need to do together to make that real. Fascism has momentum and direction. Momentum. It's moving fast by the day, advancing by the hour. Direction. Always in one direction. More repression, more violence, more terror. Direction. Project 2025 on steroids. Hitler's playbook, but with nuclear weapons. What's happening right here in DC right now is their next leap. If they can lock this down, and if people get used to it, it becomes the model for the whole country, with ever-increasing brutality and less space for us to stop it. Homeless encampments bulldozed, checkpoints in our neighborhoods, an occupying army of masked men with guns roaming the streets, hunting down black youth, dripping with their white supremacy. We have seen many beautiful people in DC rise up, and I want to make some noise for them. Make some noise for the people directing people away from checkpoints. Make some noise for the people who hear about these checkpoints and walk out of the nightclub and tell those fascists to get the fuck out. Make some noise for the people doing neighborhood patrols and cop watches alerting the community. And some noise for the people that are banging their pots and pans every night at 8 p.m. Make some noise for the veterans urging Guards members to refuse to obey unconstitutional orders. Now, as we make noise for those standing up, we gotta also be honest. We here today, all of us, are beautiful together. But when fascists take over the Capitol, when they send in the National Guard, the FBI, hunting down our youth, attacking the homeless, these streets should be flooded. Trump will not stop as long as he is allowed to remain in power. That's right. Backed by a fascist regime that will not stop until everyone they hate is either locked up, disappeared, or forced to their knees. We cannot allow this. We must drive this regime from power. Trump must go. Yeah. There is no living with this. There is no making peace with this. There is no waiting it out, doing our best to protect some people for some time while it only gets worse and worse and worse. Let's be real. We've already let it go way too far. To this end, I am honored to share an audacious, urgent call to act initiated by refusefascism.org and open to all. A bold plan that measures up to what we face. A bold plan that everyone needs to come together to realize. The time has come for the fall of the Trump fascist regime. Beginning November 5th, 2025, Washington, D.C. Fascism is not a looming threat. It is upon us now. Humanity's only hope is for the decent people of this country to rise in our millions. We cannot wait for future and rigged elections. We must drive out the Trump fascist regime from power. Beginning November 5th, the one-year anniversary of Trump's election, flood D.C. in determined and nonviolent protest. Surround the White House, surround the Capitol, surround the illegitimate fascist PAC Supreme Court. Come back again and again and again. Across the country, refuse to comply. Every person of conscience, millions of us together, grind the machinery of this fascist regime to a halt. Don't stop until Trump is moved. The Trump fascist regime is illegitimate. Say it with me. Illegitimate. What it is demanding we become unconscionable. At every level of society, in every institution, tens of millions of us know this in our very bones. If dare, we can defeat a horror that threatens humanity's very survival.
It's despicable. It's despicable.
It is. And if we fail to even try, future generations, if they exist, will never forgive us. The Trump fascist regime is shredding the rule of law, making a mockery of due process, illegitimately deploying the military on U.S. soil, disappearing immigrants and other brown-skinned citizens into brutal concentration camps, aggressively resurrecting genocidal white supremacy, reversing the gains not only of the 1960s, but even of the Civil War and Reconstruction, enslaving women through the brutality and suffocation of forced motherhood, trying to erase our LGBTQ siblings with particular venom, trampling democratic rights, violating international law, assaulting and threatening politicians and judges, paving the way for boundless terror against the people, accelerating climate collapse, cutting science and medicine, costing millions of lives, depleting humanity's store of knowledge, destroying truth, drowning out reason, subjugating the art to fascist cruelty and conformity, targeting everything that is decent, moral, and good, all at the whim of a debased lunatic tyrant. Hopes of waiting this out are illusion. Every accommodation, even in the name of preserving some ability to do some good, only fuels Trump's demand for ever more slavish submission. Every capitulation by universities, by law firms, by agencies only feeds the regime's ravenous hunger to remake all of society in its grotesque image. This is fascism, a different form of brutal rule. It cannot be lived with. It must be defeated. It must be. The elections are way too late. Besides, no honest person can expect the tyrant who instigated and then pardoned the January 6th insurrectionists to respect any election he loses. But there is a way. We have protested, marched, defended neighbors from ICE, decried genocide. Some of us have resigned or blown the whistle. This shows we are millions, many more of us than there are of them. Now we must take this higher. We must direct all of this and more towards the only thing that truly measures up to the existential threat humanity faces. The whole Trump fascist regime must be driven from power. This can be done by refusing to surrender the future and our humanity to a vengeful fascist mania, by rising in our millions, unrelenting in nonviolent protest and resistance, starting now. By defying and refusing to comply with fascist dictates. This must begin now. By walking out, by shutting down, starting now. By fearlessly using our platforms and influence to inspire and challenge others to join us, beginning now. And then we come back from all across the country, from every corner of this nation, and we flood DC. We get on that bus, we get on that plane, we get on that automobile, that unicycle, that hot air balloon. We get our butts to DC, and we do so with such determination. With such growing numbers. That all of society and the whole world takes note and takes heart, and it is the fascists who cower in fear. And we create such a political crisis, such an civil uprising so great that Trump cannot govern, that he cannot carry out his program of terror, that he cannot remain in power. By doing all of this, day after day, coming back stronger in the face of attack and repression, uniting, not dividing, coming together across many viewpoints, the religious and the atheists, the never-Trumpers and the Democrats, the anarchists, the communists, and everybody in between. Bringing people together from all different backgrounds, from the students to the octogenarians to people of all nationalities, fostering a collective spirit of courage and righteous fury, willing to sacrifice for the greater good of defeating this fascism. This starts with us. This starts today. This starts with you. So there are, at that table or coming around, there are flyers with this call. You gotta come and get stacks of it. And you gotta take it to your place of worship. That was my cue for my friends by the table to get those flyers out to everyone. We gotta fill our backpacks. We gotta go and bring them to our place of worship, our neighborhood, our schools. We gotta sign up at refusefascism.org so we know what's happening. We gotta follow Refuse Fascism on social media.
Yeah.
You are needed to bring your perspective, your voice, your talents, your network, your resources, yes, your funds, your moral conviction and commitment to the future into this fight today. If we're able to do this, if we're able to drive this regime out, it will be because you helped make that happen. History is in our hands. We have watched as institution after institution has lined up to capitulate like dominoes. But we can, and that can be part of a national strike. I will take a lot of strikes and walkouts and all sorts of things to make it happen. But part of that is instead of people and institutions capitulating like dominoes, we create a domino effect of our own. Where we force the regime to fall, where institution after institution says enough, where we inspire more courage and more refusal, where schools, hospitals, government agencies, national parks, scientific research centers, every sector doesn't cooperate, doesn't comply, and connects this with the demand that the Trump fascist regime must go. As I said before, we are the majority. There are millions of us, tens of millions of us strong, and we are in agencies and in the hospitals, in the schools, in the law firms, in the corporations across the country that this together and saying no. While it is righteous that people have resigned publicly in protest, we need people to stay and fight. We need people to tell their colleagues to join them, to stop making excuses, to demand that they stand up to fascism. And this has everything to do with flooding D.C. on November 5th, because this is the resistance that needs to start now. Where capitulation has gone on, we must demand reversal. Fascists shouldn't be the only ones that drive out a college president. If Columbia doesn't reverse, faculty and students should drive their president, Shipman, out of power. Where they haven't yet capitulated, we gotta demand that administrators don't bow down, as the thousands are doing right now to Harvard's administration. It's time to make clear that if they fold, they will face the demand for their removal from the people. Same in all the institutions, and all of this combined with the demand that this regime must be driven from power. So who can remind me, when are we flooding D.C.? Every day, and then in our millions. We're starting November 5th. So we gotta get our plane tickets, our train tickets. We gotta organize buses now. We gotta make our carpool plans, because from that day forward, it's on. We don't stop until the Trump regime is removed. The hope for humanity, for the future, is riding on what we do. Think about the songs and poems that inspire us, the civil rights icons we look up to. They're not people who just skated by in the face of atrocity. They are the people who are willing to risk it all, to change their lives, to stop great horrors. You cannot tell yourself the lie that this cannot be done. We cannot give ourselves the excuse before we even dare to try, as humanity and the planet hang in the balance. When our grandchildren or the generations yet to come ask you, what did you do during the Trump regime? When they ask you, Gramps, Grandma, what did you do when masked men rounded up your neighbors and sent them to concentration camps? When they kidnapped asylum seekers and dropped them into war zones they had no connection to, they didn't speak the language, where they were sent to be tortured or killed? What did you do when dissidents were jailed, journalists silenced, books banned, history rewritten? What will you say? I hated it. I posted a TikTok. I cried. I seethed in private, believing it was intolerable, but doing nothing? Fuck no. We must be able to say, we refuse to compromise. We moved heaven and earth to drive this regime from power. And I'll end with this. History is full of examples where people who had right on their side fought against tremendous odds and were victorious. It is also full of examples of people passively hoping to wait it out, only to get swallowed up by a horror beyond what they ever imagined. The future is unwritten. Which one we get is up to us. It's up. We're gonna make this pledge together to make it real. We're gonna spread this everywhere. In the name of humanity. In the name of humanity. We refuse to accept. We refuse to accept. A fascist America. The Trump fascist regime must go
To see more sights and sounds from the protest, visit refusefascism.org or check out our social media at Refuse Fascism. A salute to everyone who was out on the streets with me and Refuse Fascism. If you took video, photos, we want to see it all. So be sure to tag us if you haven't already in your photos and videos from yesterday. See the show notes or visit refusefascism.org to read and spread the call for relentless nonviolent protests beginning in DC on November 5th and not stopping until this regime is driven from power. While you're there, you can sign up to commit to being there starting November 5th and donating to make this effort possible. Now, here's my conversation with Sasha Abramsky. Today, we're honored to welcome back on the show acclaimed journalist and author Sasha Abramsky. Sasha serves as the Western correspondent for The Nation. You've probably read him other places as well, and is the author of Chaos Comes Calling, the battle against the far-right takeover of small-town America. This summer, we have relied on Sasha's consistent presence in The Nation for pivotal analysis on court rulings, Trump's executive orders, and threats to civil and democratic rights. And it continues to shape the critical narrative that we bring you each week. And one of the things that we really appreciate about Sasha's writing, especially this summer, is the moral urgency that he puts forward to understanding our fascist worlds that we're now living in the United States. Welcome, Sasha. Thanks so much for coming back on.
It's good to be on, Sam. Thanks for having me.
I guess I want to start with a discussion about distraction that kind of relates to an ongoing discussion that you address in your writing around normalization of this fascism that we face. And, much of the analysis and even much of the mainstream criticism of Trump in major media outlets, and I would say from the DNC overall, is focused on normalizing and rationalizing the threat Trump poses still in August 2025, where we've seen months of this nightmare. And the logic, I think, seems to go that he's a bad guy, he's a bad dude, but he isn't fundamentally changing anything. There's no fascist movement, and there's certainly not a consolidation of fascism. And I think that we see this when people stubbornly insist on analyzing every new development, takeover of DC, in isolation from everything else he's doing or saying. That one thing, like ramping up ICE actions, is a distraction from another, like burying information on Epstein. But I get the sense that if we understand their vision of government, it's much easier to see what's actually developing. And I wanted to get your take on what is the big picture that all these elements are a part of, and how should that inform our understanding of these different moves that we've seen even just this past week?
When you say there's no fascist movement, that is true only if you define fascism as being a movement that uses the word fascism in its label. So yes, the MAGA movement does not have an F in it. It is not Make America Fascist Again. It's Make America Great Again. But if you actually look at what MAGA is doing, if you look at what Trump is doing, if you look at, as you said, at what is being normalized, it fits a series of checkboxes that we recognize as fascism. And I guess the way I think of it is there are plenty of diseases that when doctors are analyzing a patient and trying to work out what that patient has, there's no single assay. There's no single test. You can do a blood test and you can say you've got this disease. You can do that for some diseases, but there are many other diseases you just reach by a diagnosis, that you have a set of symptoms, the doctor looks at those symptoms, they eliminate all the other causes, and they say, well, we think you have this because you meet the symptom. Well, if you look at what's happening in America today, you can say, all right, we have a series of symptoms, and when you analyze what those symptoms are, the conclusion is you're suffering from a bout of fascism. And what are those symptoms? What are being normalized? Well, we've militarized law enforcement. So we're putting National Guard and Marines into American cities. Well, that's A, unconstitutional, and B, it's textbook authoritarianism. We're going after the independence of university. We're saying that you have to enforce a code of conduct. You have to enforce an ideological purity test. Otherwise, you're going to lose your funding. We're going after museums and cultural institutions and saying unless the Smithsonian meets purity tests, ideological purity tests, its leadership is going to be fired. We're dismantling independent ombudsman structures, independent watchdog structures. We're normalizing the presence of secret police, wearing masks unidentified, not carrying badges, who arrest people in broad daylight and chuck them into unmarked police vans. Well, every single one of those things that I'm identifying, and there are many, many more that I haven't talked about, every single one of those is a textbook symptom of a society falling into fascism. So they don't have to use the word fascism. The Republican Party doesn't have to use the word fascism. MAGA doesn't have to use the word fascism. But on a daily basis, we are normalizing things that are so far removed from any Enlightenment constitutional concept of democracy that they can only be understood as fascism. Look, I was talking to you earlier and we were talking about the country of Portugal. Portugal had a fascist leadership for nearly half a century. Spain had a fascist leadership for nearly half a century. You can fall into a slow-moving fascist leadership. It doesn't have to have all the pyrotechnics of Nazism or of Mussolini's fascism in Italy. You can fall into a slow-rolling fascist calamity that ruins a society for decades. That's what happened in Portugal. It's what happened in Spain. It's what happened in Chile under Pinochet. And it looks like it's what's happening under Trump's America. And unless we identify that, and unless we say, look, here's why it's fascism, then we are not going to have any roadmap to get out of this nightmare.
I think that that's really helpful. And I also think that if we continue to obscure the threat and every escalation or tightening of the fascist grip that we see, we chalk up to a distraction of other crimes of the regime, then we're always going to be coming from behind in addressing it. If everything is minimized, in a way, we're learning to live with every day more and more of this open terror in terms of a form of rule. And we're going to be further and further along the road. And I think one of the points that you made about some of what we begin to see, I think just to any decent person should also smack of total illegitimacy. Everything that this regime has done is completely illegitimate.
Let me use stronger language, because illegitimate sort of implies that it's sort of, a reasonable political discourse, but we just think you're a little bit on the edge. What these guys are doing is normalizing behavior that is shameful and degrading and involves everybody who gets co-opted into it in rolling around in the moral mud. So when you're talking about the creation of Alligator Alcatraz, you can use a funny name and call it Alligator Alcatraz, and it sort of sounds like a Disney theme park thing. What is Alligator Alcatraz? Alligator Alcatraz is a concentration camp. We don't call it a concentration camp, but to all intents and purposes, it is a concentration camp in the Everglades. It would have been familiar to the residents of Dachau, which was the early concentration camp in Nazi Germany. When we have armed, masked, nameless officers taking old men from their workplaces, wrestling them to the ground and throwing them into vans. And I've seen videos of this from LA in the last few days. That is not just mildly illegitimate. Anyone who is involved in that operation is as morally culpable as the torturers of apartheid South Africa, the disappearance people, the specialists who drop people from helicopters and everything else in dictatorships in Latin America. It is not just that it's marginally illegitimate. It's that they are creating a political spectacle that falls outside the boundaries of anything that is morally acceptable in any Western democracy. So if we're going to have a concept of democracy, and if we're going to have a meaningful concept of the Western world with what it implies, a sort of values adhering to the Enlightenment, a rationalist political debate, a pluralist, democratic, tolerant political culture, if that's going to mean anything, we have to find a way to explain to the American public not just that Trump's administration is mildly illegitimate, but that it is pushing thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people to do things that are deeply, deeply morally corrosive. And these are things that we can say, oh, well, they're just doing their jobs. They're doing their jobs in the worst conceivable way. They are obeying illegitimate orders, and they are behaving in a shameful way like the good denizens of other fascist dictatorships in bygone decades. People who said, well, it's not my decision, I'm just obeying orders. Well, yes, you are just obeying orders. You happen to be obeying orders that are putting your fellow residents into places like Alligator Alcatraz. And that is morally shameful.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that we have to be uncompromising in that language. I think that there's two sides of it, and they're connected. There's the moral repugnancy And there's also the political illegitimacy. And the illegitimate I was speaking to, that this does not fall into any form of, you want to call yourself a constitutional republic. This is completely outside of that. And I think your point on not just complicity, but what amounts to collaboration and
and I want to follow up on that, because one of the things I forgot to mention at the beginning was one of the hallmarks of a fascist state is the manipulation of information. If you're going to say, let's have a policy debate on tariffs, that's fine. That's within the democratic sort of rubric. You can have that debate. I can say to you, I think your tariff policy is completely insane. And you can say to me, well, I believe in McKinley's vision of America and we're going to, use tariffs to build a wall around our economy. That's a legitimate policy debate. Where it becomes beyond legitimate, where it goes into a dark, dark realm, is if you produce a whole bunch of tariff policies, those tariff policies lead to inflation and unemployment, your statisticians deliver you the verdict saying, you may want to look at this data, the unemployment rate's ticking up again, and your response is you fire the messenger and you bring in pliant statisticians who are going to give you the data that you want to present to the public. That's when it ceases to be a democratic debate, because it's not based on real information anymore. It's based on raw, naked propaganda and the threat of the state to make, break, and ruin people's careers if they deliver the quote-unquote wrong information. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing what could be legitimate policy debates slide into this deeply, deeply totalitarian idea, whereas if you say the wrong thing, if you deliver the wrong news, if you provide the wrong piece of information or data that makes the big boss unhappy, you will pay with your career. Well, there's nothing democratic about that. Thank God we have not reached the point where we're summarily executing people. Hopefully we never will. We have most certainly reached a point where we are grabbing people off the streets. We are ruining their lives if we think they're saying the wrong things or doing the wrong things. We're deporting people not for criminal activities, but for what they have written in opinion pieces if they happen to be non-citizens and at universities the government is targeting. We are expelling scientists from their workplaces, not for criminal activities, but for daring to research things like climate change or women's health or differences in the ways that different races respond to different medications and so on. We are making it essentially a criminal act to think outside of the methods of approved thinking that the government has signed off on. Well, again, that's quintessential authoritarianism or totalitarianism. And again, the label doesn't quite matter. You can call it fascism, you can call it, state authoritarianism, whatever you want to call it. It isn't democracy. So maybe that's the best way of talking about this, the absence of what it is. There's an absence of an understanding of democracy in this administration, and that absence is permeating through every level of American civic life at this point.
I wanted to talk about something that you recently wrote about. You had recently wrote about a Libyan man living in North Carolina who was seized by ICE, interrogated about a country he has no connection with, detained, and whose release had to be mandated by courts multiple times before he was let out. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about this quote-unquote zero release policy, as one immigration lawyer called it, the role of ICE and law enforcement, the courts and the law in Trump's America.
Yes, one of the, benefits of being a journalist who's writing about all of this is the more I write about it, the more sources contact me from all over the country and say, hey, you may want to look at this story. A friend of mine in North Carolina who works in immigration issues contacted me a couple of weeks ago and said, look, there's this case here where there's this guy, he's a Libyan national, he's been in the country for 15 years, he came here on a legitimate visa, he claimed asylum when he got here. This was under Gaddafi's regime. And he's been a member of the Greensboro community for 15 years. And suddenly, the other day, he was arrested and was sort of secretively detained, and ICE didn't say where he was, etc., etc. I phoned his lawyer. He'd ended up with an immigration lawyer after being detained. His family had hired one. The community had come together. Not all immigrants. The community as a whole had come together because he was a respected member of the neighborhood, and they'd raised a GoFundMe, and they had started publicizing what was going on. And by the time I got notice of this case, he'd been in ICE holding for, I can't remember the exact number of days, quite a long time. There were many, many local clergy who had gotten involved in his case, local immigration rights advocates, and a large number of state political elected officials. So this was not sort of some guy who, was just on the margins, nobody was paying attention to. He was a respected member of the community, and when he got arrested and detained, large numbers of people got involved in seeking his release. Well, the immigration attorney told me that what ICE had told her, or the agents interrogating her had told her was that they had been ordered, this was just around the period when America and Israel were bombing Tehran and the nuclear facilities in Iran. They said they'd basically been ordered to ask any detained Arab about their knowledge of Iranian spy activities in the US and knowledge of Iranian plans to shut the Straits of Hormuz and knowledge of sleeper cells in the US. Well, there was no evidence that this guy had any connection to Iran. None at all. And I'm not the one saying that. That is what the immigration community had concluded. That's what the lawyers had concluded. That's what the judges had concluded. But ICE wouldn't release him. And the attorney said, well, why aren't you releasing my guy? You've clearly got the wrong person. This is a misunderstanding. You picked someone up thinking he was someone else. He's not the Iranian spy you think he is. He's a Libyan guy working on repairing refrigerator units for Wendy's fast food restaurant. Can you release him? And she told me that what she was basically told was, under Trump, we have a zero release policy. Once we get our hands on an immigrant, even if we've detained them for the wrong reason, we're not going to release them. That's an outrageous thing to say. I mean, it literally is the hunting of human beings. It's very similar to the fugitive slave hunting of the pre-Civil War period. Anyway, this guy remained in detention for days and days and days. Finally, as you said, under court order, because the court had ordered him released on bond and the government had refused to release him. Finally, under court order and immense public pressure, he was released, but he's now facing removal proceedings. So this is a guy who's been in the country for 15 years. He's playing by the rules. He's trying to get asylum. He's attending his mandated court hearings. He's doing everything he is supposed to be doing. He's an upstanding member of the community. He is working to support his family. And now, because he was accidentally ensnared in this dragnet, and because Trump has this sort of policy of always pushing back harder, so, if you have some guy and he's the wrong guy, and it makes the government look bad, you double down. That's what they did with Garcia when they accidentally deported him to Secot in El Salvador, and then they brought him back and they trumped up these human trafficking charges against him. Now it's what they're doing to this man in North Carolina. Once you get a guy, you can't admit your mistake. And so this guy who's been in the country for 15 years is now facing deportation and removal, not because he did anything wrong, but because the government screwed up and caught him in a dragnet and thought he was somebody else. Well, again, the mark of any morally decent institution or individual is the ability to admit when you make a mistake. Humility, humbleness, empathy. None of that is here. What we are seeing instead is this completely Kafkaesque situation where if you get caught in a dragnet, definitionally, you become the bad guy. And once you've been identified as the bad guy, all rules are off and the government can do whatever it likes. Well, again, if someone can explain to me how that is in any meaningful sense democratic or pluralistic, let me know. But I don't think you're going to be able to, because it isn't. It's definitionally antithetical to the values of democracy. And that's where we are. We've got the most powerful people in the world with the vast apparatus of the federal US government behind it, working not for the betterment of ordinary people, but working to humiliate, punish, and act their acts of sadism out against those individuals. You don't have to take my word for it. You can read the New York Times, you can read the Washington Post, you can read testimony from the thousands of immigrants caught up in these dragnets. All you have to do is have an open enough mind to actually listen and watch these stories. If you don't, if you say it's all fake news, anything that disagrees with the Trump narrative is fake news, then you're not going to get there. You're not going to see it. But you're shortchanging yourself intellectually. You're living in a bubble. And Republicans are very good at saying, well, you're snowflakes because you can't take criticism. God damn it. The people who can't take criticism at the moment are the most powerful people on earth, who are so thin-skinned that if anybody, a journalist, a student, an immigration rights advocate, a garment worker, if anybody dares to say, you know what, you guys have done something wrong, they double down and they use the might of the state against them. That's snowflake politics. And it's coming not from the left, it's coming from the authoritarian, scared right.
I think that that's a really important point. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, we had mentioned DC previously in terms of what's developing, and I wanted to talk about that development a little bit more because I think it concentrates so much, and in terms of parallels to fascist projects, I think it is extremely stark. In particular, parallels to Nazi Germany and Hitler's quote-unquote cosmetic changes that were needed to society and what that led to, and Pinochet's role in Chile. in DC, we have this total takeover happening. I don't need to tell you about what they've done, but for listeners, it's the federalizing of the police, it's the sending in the National Guard, it's the threatening for this to be a takeover that is not temporary, but is permanent. Just, I think, yesterday, 74 people were arrested based on this totally illegitimate crackdown on crime, targeting, in particular, homeless youth and Black folks. That's really what this is about. And this targeting of the homeless is what I wanted to talk to you in particular about. What is this about? What does, quote unquote, the homeless have to do with their strategy and their vision?
Look, I've been involved in criminal justice reform organizations, writing about them, thinking about mass incarceration and so on for 30 years. It's how I started my journalistic career. I don't know anybody in the criminal justice reform community who gets up in the morning and says, high crime is a good thing. No one. There's nobody who gets up and says, we love having high crime, we love having homelessness, we love having drug addiction. Nobody gets up in the morning and says that. Anybody who's credible, who's thinking about criminal justice issues, gets up in the morning and they say, how can we reduce crime? How can we reduce homelessness? How can we reduce drug addiction? And we got a lot of things that we know through trial and error work and a lot of things that don't work. We know that if you want to reduce homelessness, build more affordable housing. We know that. It works. We know that if you want to help people who are mentally ill and drug addicted and living on the streets, provide wraparound social services, make it easier for them to enroll in drug treatment, make it easier for mental health outreach people to reach them. There are things that work, that have track records. You can look at the data, and I know Trump doesn't really look at data unless it sort of backs his vision, but you can look at data and you can find programs that have taken high crime communities and reduced the crime rate spectacularly through massive intervention. But those interventions don't tend to be law enforcement first. They involve law enforcement. Sure, you've got to have police on the streets. You've got to have credible threat of arrest. If somebody's brandishing a gun or somebody's hurting people, absolutely. You arrest them, you take them through the criminal justice system, and those people are going to go to prison. I know almost nobody. I mean, there are a few prison abolitionists out there, but almost nobody is going to tell you if somebody is a danger to society, they should just be left to be a danger to society. Nobody's going to say that. But Trump is taking shortcuts here. If Trump was really interested in a sensible criminal justice policy, he wouldn't have defunded to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars anti-crime strategies around the country that work. But he has defunded them. He's taken away money from re-entry programs, job training programs, affordable housing programs, mental health services, addiction treatment. He's reduced the services available to veterans suffering PTSD and living on the streets. At every level, Trump's policies are going to make crime worse, homelessness worse, drug addiction and mental illness worse. And the shortcut he's taking is he's then going to say, well, we're going to come in and we're going to sweep the streets of homeless. And we're going to come in and we're going to have federal law enforcement and military officers setting up checkpoints and arresting people, not because of what they've done, but because of what they look like. And he says to the police, if they spit at you, you hit them. That's an almost direct quote from him the other day. Well, if you're saying to the police violence is now officially condoned from the White House, well, then you're going to get police violence. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that. These are all shortcuts. If you liberate the police, quote unquote, to act more violently, you don't make communities safer, you make communities more resentful. If you send the military onto American street, you don't make those streets safer, you make the flashpoints more likely. Because people, not surprisingly, are going to get angry that their civil rights are being trodden on. And that in a society that has laws against the domestic deployment of the military, Trump is ignoring those laws and he's putting up military checkpoints in cities. Now, the biggest thing here is look at where this is happening. This isn't happening in conservative-run cities. This is happening in LA, where they sent in the Marines and the National Guard. It's happening in DC, which conservatives have long hated, and you can argue that that's racial. You know, there are many ways you can argue what it's about, but they've hated DC and its home rule for decades. He's talked about bringing in federal troops into New York, Chicago, and a handful of other Democratic-run cities. What he has not talked about, and you will not hear him talk about, is sending in those federal troops into conservative parts of the country, which in many cases have far higher crime rates. You want to look at where the murder rates are highest. It's not LA, and it's not DC, it's Louisiana, it's Mississippi, and it's a handful of other states in the Deep South which have absolutely no gun control, which are run by deeply conservative administrations, which have defunded all the social service and intervention programs that we know work. Those are the states that have the high crime rates. But Trump and his allies in Congress, none of them are talking about sending in the military into their own backyards. What they're talking about is sending in the military as an occupation force into Democratic-run cities, counties, and states in America. America. That's not democracy. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a bill of goods.
I really appreciate you pulling back about if this is about crime, this is what you would do. And the reality that the biggest criminal, let's be clear, in DC right now is not the youth he despises or the people who are unhoused. The biggest criminal in the White House is the genocidal racist in the White House. That is the biggest criminal. And I think your point about if we were really concerned about where crime is the highest, let's look about where that is. I'm not saying we should send the military, to be clear, to these cities as the solution, but that it's not consistent. I do think that people have the question about, okay, well, if it's, what is this really about? What is he trying to do here with DC? And I think that there's two targets. One of the target is, in my opinion, the masses of people that he is going after. He is going after those who he hates and his regime hates, those who he sees undesirable, and eliminating them. But it also is, he's going after Democratic Party leadership. And I think it's two, I think it's going after his opposition and going after the mass of people. And I wanted your take on what this is about.
Well, he's springing a trap, partly his animus. He clearly doesn't like Democratic-run cities, and he really doesn't like Democratic-run majority African-American cities. He's made that abundantly clear in statements going all the way back to the 70s and 80s. There's an animus there. But I think the other thing is he's politically savvy, and he's sprung a political trap here, because the danger is that he frames it as a crime and punishment issue, and Democrats push back, and he can then paint Democrats as being soft on crime, which is why I think it's so important, and why I open the answer by saying, look, it's not about soft on crime, because there are far more effective crime responses that don't involve militarizing law enforcement. The Democrats have to be careful here, because if they just say, we don't want the military, everything else, Trump's going to say, you're soft on crime, you're not looking after Americans. What they have to say is, we don't want the military, A, because it's unconstitutional, and B, because it's counterproductive. That if you militarize the police response to everything, you don't get lower crime in the end, you just get a more sullen, resentful population, and a lot of the issues get pushed underground, and a lot of the cooperation that law enforcement needs from the community vanishes, because law enforcement needs a community to cooperate, to identify where the trouble spots are, or where the gang activity is, or everything else. But if the community regards itself as being under occupation, as being a sort of colonized people under occupation by a military, that cooperation stops. And so in the long run, if you surge enough people into DC, you may get a short-term decline in crime. But in the long run, you're actually setting up very dangerous, very unstable social conditions. And Democrats have to work out a way to frame this. Trump is basically using every lever of government for short-term political advantage or short-term economic advantage. Changing the conversation a bit, but you could say the exact same thing about climate change. In the short term, it makes sense for an anti-environmental presidency like Trump's to fire all the climate scientists and get rid of all the climate data. And you can, in the short term, have a bonanza for the fossil fuel industry and everything else. And you can put all these punitive taxes on solar energy and all the other renewable energies. You can try and wreck the development of the EV infrastructure. You can do all that in the short term. You may create, as I said, a short-term binge for the fossil fuel industry. In the short term, energy prices may become cheaper for consumers. And then in the long run, you have accelerated climate change and all the damage that goes with that. You have environmental degradation. You have communities being hit by harder and harder hurricanes and droughts and forest fires, everything else that goes with that. And the infrastructure to deal with it has been destroyed. I think everything about the decisions that are being made are short-termism. They're all about producing bang for the buck today and tomorrow, producing a TV spectacle today and tomorrow. And none of them involve long-term coherent thinking. And that goes for whether it's crime and punishment in DC, or whether it's climate change, or whether it's universities, or whether it's immigration, because we're going to get rid of so many immigrants, we're not going to have home health workers. We're not going to have construction workers. We're not going to have farm laborers. We're going to have a whole bunch of industries that are going to cease to function properly in the next few years because so many workers have either been deported or are in hiding. Well, that's not going to make for a richer, wealthier, stabler economy. That's going to make for chaos. But it's all done for the photo op in the moment. The fact that you can then send out to your MAGA base propaganda showing this clampdown on undocumented immigrants. Everything about this moment is short-termism, and everything about this moment is designed for the TV and social media spectacle. That might make good politics, makes lousy policy. It makes for a dumbed-down idiocracy, essentially, where all of the intellectual thought that goes into sensible policymaking has vanished. And everything becomes about for the moment and the propaganda spectacle. It doesn't make for a stable, secure society in any way, shape, or form. But I don't think Trump's interested in a stable, secure society. He wants chaos, because chaos is the medium that he thrives in. It's his petri dish. It's where his particular rancid form of political life flourishes. It's in a petri dish where he can have one chaotic element after another added into the ingredient mix. It doesn't work. It works maybe for a short-term electoral boost. It doesn't work in terms of a stable society.
I think that it's incredibly clarifying. For all they talk about like strength and stability, okay, maybe strength and stability, but not for the kind of world that any decent person wants to live in. And I think that the more that we accept the terms of debate that they set, crime and punishment, like whatever that is, the more detached from reality we become. Because these are not, I definitely agree with you about like the fascist spectacle of how they advance and the getting people to go along with things that even a day before you would think were intolerable. Would we think 6 months ago we'd have the National Guard in the streets of the nation's capital and people would just go on with their life as usual? That's, to me, a big part of it.
You're absolutely right that we normalize the unnormalizable at our peril, because the longer we normalize the unnormalizable, the harder it's going to be to get back to a civic society. And this is what I was saying earlier about the sort of moral swamp. If you make enough people roll around in the mud, then you end up with a muddy society. If you fire all the decent people, then, there's that pungent phrase about what rises to the top. It's not the good stuff that rises to the top. And that's what we're doing. We're basically privileging the most morally malleable people. Those are the ones who are getting promoted under Trump. You want to lead an agency? Sacrifice your understanding of the Constitution. You want to rise up the ranks of the military? Put aside your concerns about using the military for domestic law enforcement. You want to rise up the ranks of government agency like the EPA? Well, then you've got to do absolute contortions because you've got to ignore all the data that says that climate change is a reality. You want to rise up the ranks of the health system in this country now? Well, the fact that for 200 years we've been vaccinating kids to pretty good effect. We've eliminated diseases like smallpox. We've controlled diseases like measles and polio and all these other diseases that used to kill by the millions. But you want to rise up the ranks of Robert Kennedy's health system? You've got to put aside all that knowledge. You've got to say, hey, maybe vaccines aren't such a good idea after all. Maybe we should go back to the 17th or 18th century. Well, that's insanity. It's like, almost a quintessential definition of insanity. But in Trumpland, in Trumplandia, that's the kind of person who's going to succeed. It's the doctors who put aside the Hippocratic Oath. It's the generals who put aside loyalty to the Constitution. It's the Justice Department officials who put aside any obligation to the truth and fealty to the law. It's the worst kind of people who thrive in an administration like this. And the longer it goes on, the longer the damage. And we've seen this in other countries. Poland had a similar experiment. They went through this intensely nationalistic, populist, irrationalist moment. And then there was eventually a vote of reaction. But the problem was the entire apparatus of the civil service was now seeded with these populists. The judges were nationalists and populists. The civil servants had been politicized. The scientists had scrubbed data. Well, we're going to see all those same problems at the back end of Trumpism. You're going to have a federal administration that's seeded with the worst kind of climbers, the lickspittles, the people who will do anything to secure the good graces of the boss, the people who have kissed the ring, and once they kissed that ring, they couldn't stop kissing the ring because it became seductive, because it gave them access to power. Again, I don't care if you're left-wing or right-wing. Do you want the people who kiss the ring to be in charge of your lives and your well-being and your data and everything else for the next many, many decades? If you do, fine, you're in a good space. But if you're worried about those kind of people having that amount of control over the most personal aspects of your life, then you need to be paying attention to what's happening. I mean, look, there are thousands of people being employed by ICE at the moment, recruited by ICE. And those people are reportedly be given $50,000 signing bonuses. And the New York Times reported a week or two back that the Trump administration was about to unveil a pilot program that was then quickly revoked once the oxygen of publicity was sent its way. But the New York Times reported there was this pilot program that was going to pay these new recruits $200 a pop for each immigrant they got deported without due process. Well, that's outrageous. I mean, you're literally incentivizing illegal action where you short-circuit people's asylum claims, their refugee status, their temporary protected status, all the other things that have let them be in this country. You short-circuit all of that and you essentially dump them over the border, or you put them on a helicopter and send them somewhere, or an airplane and send them to South Sudan or whatever it might be. And you do that with a financial incentive. It's literally bounty hunting. Well, when you incentivize that kind of utterly immoral and, probably illegal behavior, you're going to get the worst kind of elements of society applying for those jobs. You're not going to get the principled people. They're going to look at it, they're going to say thanks, but no thanks, I'm going to sit this one out. But you are going to get people who are at best sort of morally dubious characters. You're going to get people who don't actually think twice about hurting other human beings. They don't care about the implications of separating family members. And those are the kind of people at the moment who are coming into government service and rising quickest up the ranks. And that's dangerous. I'm working a lot on federal workers. I've been doing a lot of reporting on the firing of federal workers. Well, if the people who have principles, who are doing good scientific research get fired, the people who are, doing worker protection get fired, the people who are working on, really important health initiatives get fired. Well, the people who take their place tend to be the most malleable. They tend to be the ones who are going to be like, you know what, I can tolerate this. This isn't so bad. I'll get a paycheck. I'll get a bonus for signing on. I'll get some security. And they sign on and they get that security from the government. They get a little bit of financial input, but it comes at this cost. And you said, what's it going to do? I mean, I'm not religious, but if I were, I'd be asking, what's it going to do to these people's souls? If I were religious, I'd be saying, well, these people are doing an awful lot of things that are stacking up some pretty bad karma against them. That, in the grand scheme of the universe, when you do the kinds of things that we're seeing these masked ICE agents doing in immigrant communities, your soul is going to be corroded. You don't really have to be religious to sort of understand that concept. You're going to spend a lot of time later in your life thinking through what you did during the Trump years. And at some point, quite likely, your children or your grandchildren are going to ask, you know what, Grandpa, you told me once you were an ICE agent in 2025, but that was during the Trump era, wasn't it? And they were putting people in concentration camps in cages. Were you involved in that, Grandpa? And as an old man, you're going to be looking back. You're going to have to tell your grandkids, yeah, in 2025, I accepted a signing bonus for a few $1,000s and I sold my soul to Trump. And then whatever Trump asked me to do, I couldn't say no. When Trump asked me to arrest that old man working at the car wash, I couldn't say no. When Trump asked me to put someone in an airplane and send them to a war-torn zone in South Sudan, where they have no cultural connection, no language connection, no family connection, where they'll probably die, either of violence or of starvation, I no longer could say no. When Trump asked me to round people up and put them in Guantanamo Bay, or send them to CICOT in El Salvador, or send them to Alligator Alcatraz, I couldn't say no. And their grandkids are going to look at these old people and they're going to say, you were on the wrong side of history, Granddad. I love you anyway, you're my grandfather, but you were on the wrong side of history. And that is what these men are going to have to, it's mainly men, that is what they are going to have to live with for making this decision to go along with these unconstitutional and illegal acts.
And I think the same question is posed to all the decent people who aren't in that. How long will we allow to be ruled this way? And will we accept this?
Well, I think you're seeing an increasing number of people who, in creative, peaceful ways, are bearing witness. We're seeing people turning up at courts as volunteers. We're seeing people being citizen journalists and taking photographs and videos of what's going on and publicizing them. We're seeing people come out from the community when these arrests are going down. Saw it in San Diego last month when local favorite restaurant was raided, and suddenly people were pouring out of their surrounding houses to protest what ICE was doing. So people are bearing witness, and people are saying not in our name.
It's incredibly important. And in my opinion, we have to move from bearing witness, as important as that is, to, in nonviolent but determined ways, really grinding the machinery of this fascist regime to a halt. Moving from learning to live with and accommodate to this new normal to defeating it is a gap we have to close. I want to thank you, Sasha, for coming back on, for taking the time to share your expertise of being on the ground and interviewing so many people about what's happening and unfolding. Thank you for your writing and continuing to try to wake people up so that we can respond in collective action. And we're going to link to some of your most recent pieces for The Nation, your Santa Fe piece that I think just came out. And is there anything else that you want to direct people to or anything like that?
I'm doing a column, comes out tomorrow, Friday, on the immigrant rights protests in Los Angeles.
We'll definitely include that as well. Thanks again, Sasha.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Your support is needed now to get the message of this show and this movement organizing on a whole different level, influencing millions. So I hope that you'll contribute today at refusefascism.org. Just hit the donate button or text support to 855-755-1314. You can also join our Patreon community at patreon.com/refusefascism, where your support keeps this show going and fighting against this fascist nightmare. And for $0, help spread the show far and wide by sharing it with your friends, your families, your networks. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Drop a comment on our socials or our YouTube. Every share and every word helps build this fight and keep us going. Find us on social media at Refuse Fascism, including on Blue Sky, and follow us on TikTok at Refuse Fascism, where fascism is spelled incorrectly, Fashizm. Much appreciation to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkleman for their amazing work producing the show. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.